Hi, class. Welcome to week 9, and this is my second to last lecture, so the end of the quarter is right around the corner. If you have any questions about the final paper or anything like that, or about your grade as it stands right now, don't hesitate to contact me. Today we'll be discussing personhood. In other words, we'll evaluate what necessary and sufficient conditions must be met in order to say a being is a person. Okay. Now, this topic might sound strange to you, but let's start by noting that being a person is different from being a human. As our textbook points out, human is a biological concept, meaning that someone is a Homo sapiens. Person is actually a philosophical concept, and it indicates that you are a being with certain capacities. To demonstrate this, just think of someone who is brain dead. They are alive and they are human, but it's not quite accurate to say that they are a person. And that's why we don't call the ending of life support for them murder. Also, as I'll be exploring in this lecture, there is controversy among pro-life and pro-choice advocates about whether to designate a fetus as a person with rights. Although both sides can agree that a fetus is a human. So this indicates that there is an important distinction in the terms human and person, and they shouldn't be treated as the same. Now, if human and person are not synonymous, this means that there is a possibility that a member of another species might be a person, and our author builds a case for dolphins being counted as persons. So a lot of what our author points out about dolphins has to do with their abilities to experience emotions, the fact that they have a sense of self, their ability to recognize other persons and treat them appropriately, and their sophisticated cognitive abilities. All these things are counted as reasons for calling them persons. And they're reasons that we usually use for calling humans persons. And our author makes an argument for extending the same criteria for all beings. So please read the chapter, as it provides a great exploration of the concept of personhood through an actual case study. What I would like to do in this lecture is discuss a controversial topic in which the issue of personhood is at the center of the debate, and this is the issue of abortion. The status of the fetus has all sorts of moral and legal implications, and as I mentioned already, it's debatable whether a fetus should be classified as a person, even when it should clearly be classified as a human. So let's start by discussing the development of a fetus to help ground the discussion. So here's a week-by-week overview of the development of a fetus. So week 1, the baby is an embryo consisting of 2 layers of cells from which all her organs and body parts will develop. Week 2, the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm develop, which are the 3 basic layers of embryo development. And in week 3, the beginnings of a backbone develops, as does the neural tube. So this week, week 3, presents the beginning of the development of the brain and spinal cord. In week 4, the heart and blood vessels start developing, and the umbilical cord is developing, and the embryo is about 5 millimeters long. The brain is developing, as well as the lymph buds, which are small swellings, which are the start of arms and legs, and the heart starts to beat and pump blood. And in week 6, the eyes and ears start to form. And in week 7, all the major internal organs are forming. The face is forming, the eyes have some color, the mouth and tongue are forming. We have the beginnings of hands and feet, and the fetus is about 17 millimeters long. Week 8 is the fetal stage. At this point, all major structures, including hands, feet, head, brain, and other organs, are present, but they will continue to grow, develop, and become more functional. When the fetal stage commences, a fetus is typically about 30 millimeters, or 1.2 inches in length from crown to rump. and weighs about 8 grams. The heart is beating. The fingers and toes have separated from each other, and some fingerprint formation can be seen from the beginning of the fetal stage. Um, by the fetal stage, the embryonic tail is gone, and an atrophied embryonic tail bud remains. In week 9, the first movements occur. Weeks 9 through 12. At 9 weeks, the fetus is able to bend fingers around an object in response to a touch on the foot. The fetus bends the legs or curls the toes to move away from an object. And the face is well formed, and the fetus is 3 to 6 inches in length. And from weeks 9 to 12, the head makes up nearly half of the fetus's size. The fetal eyelids are closed and remain closed for several months. And the appearance of the genitals in males and females becomes more apparent. The fetus begins drinking amniotic fluid about 12 weeks after fertilization for hydration and nutrition. Tooth buds appear, the limbs are long and thin, and red blood cells are produced in the liver. However, the majority of red blood cells will be made later in gestation at 21 weeks by bone marrow. Okay, at weeks 16 to 25, the lanugo covers the entire body. Eyebrows, eyelashes, fingernails, and toenails appear. The fetus has increased muscle development. Air sacs are forming in the lungs, and the nervous system develops enough to control some body functions. The respiratory system has developed to the point where gas exchange is possible. And by the end of the 5th month, the fetus is about 20 centimeters or 8 inches. Weeks 26 to 38, the amount of body fat rapidly increases. Lungs are not fully mature. The thalamic brain connections, which mediate sensory input, form. Bones are fully developed, but are still soft and pliable. Iron, calcium, and phosphorus becomes more abundant. Fingernails reach the end of the fingertips. Head hair becomes coarse and thicker. Birth is imminent and occurs around the 38th week. The fetus is considered full term between weeks 35 and 40, which means that the fetus is considered sufficiently developed for life outside the uterus. And it may be 48 to 53 centimeters in length when born. And control of movement is limited at birth, and purposeful voluntary movements develop all the way until puberty. Now, before we dive into the debate over personhood and when or if a fetus is a person, let's look at the history of abortion in the U.S. So abortion was made a crime in the 19th century, except in those cases when the mother's life was in danger. And in 1973, the Supreme Court ruling for Roe v. Wade deemed a state law that banned abortions, except to save the life of the mother, was unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court ruled that states were forbidden from outlawing or regulating any aspect of abortion performed during the first trimester of pregnancy. The states could only enact abortion regulations reasonably related to maternal health in the 2nd and 3rd trimesters, and could enact abortion laws protecting the life of the fetus only in the 3rd trimester. And the ruling was based on protecting a woman's right to privacy. Now, pro-life advocates argue that a fetus is a person and so has a right to life. And further, the right to life is more important or fundamental than a right to privacy. And so it should trump a woman's right to privacy, and the fetus should be protected at all stages. However, Justice Blackmun denied that a fetus is a person in the sense that the word is used in the Constitution. And he also argued that should a fetus be deemed a person by anyone, quote, the unborn have never been recognized in the law as persons in the whole sense. So you can see that in the Supreme Court decision, personhood was at the center of the debate. let's look at three positions on abortion, starting with the right to life position. So the extreme right to life position holds that abortion is always wrong no matter what stage the fetus is in. The philosopher John Noonan defended this position, arguing that uh, if you are conceived by human parents, you are human, and that every organism that is genetically human has a moral right to life. Now, we've seen that being human doesn't make one a person, and we generally give people rights. Noonan's argument is based on the idea that a genetically human zygote is a very valuable organism because it has the potential to develop into a fully functioning human being that can think, feel, love, hate, laugh, suffer, dream, and plan. All things that can be said to make a human a person. So his argument is based on potential, but protects a human's right to life from the moment of conception, based on that human's potential to be a person. Christians also typically hold a right to life position. Catholics, for instance, argue that anything with a soul has a moral right to life, and ensoulment occurs at conception. On the opposite extreme, we have the extreme right to choose position. So advocates of this position argue that abortion is always morally acceptable, no matter what stage of development a fetus is in. So they don't share the metaphysical outlook related to the ensoulment of a fetus, the way the Catholics do, and Christians. And they hold that being human doesn't in itself give you rights. You must be a person, not a potential person. Okay? So how would people in this extreme right to choose camp see a person? Well, they would consider what makes people different from, say, dogs or cats or trees. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt gives us some guidance on this, and he argues that a lot of things have first-order volitions, a volition being a desire or a will. For example, a dog is hungry, so his volition is to eat. Harry Frankfurt argues that only people have second-order volitions. That is, people want to want something or to not want something. For example, a first-order volition might be that I want to eat a candy bar. A second-order volition might be that I'm on a diet and I want to be a person who does not want a candy bar. When we conform to these second-order volitions, we feel good about ourselves. When we fail to conform to them, then we feel bad. And it takes a highly sophisticated, fully functioning brain to have second-order volitions. And often humans aren't the kinds of beings who have them. For instance, when someone is in a coma, they do not. And when someone is a fetus, arguably, they do not. A fetus, using this definition, is a potential person, but according to the extreme right to choose camp, doesn't have human rights until it's an actual person. And using Frankfurt, that means until it actually has second-order volitions. On this basis, an abortion is morally permitted at any stage of pregnancy. Now, some philosophers have argued that even if a fetus is considered a person, perhaps on its potential or on the basis that human DNA makes it a person, it is morally permissible for a woman to abort it nonetheless. So let's consider an argument by Judith Jarvis Thompson. She says, a famous violinist is dying from kidney disease. She can be saved only if she is physically attached to you for 9 months so that your kidneys can take over the functioning of her kidneys. No one else can save her because you are the only person physically compatible with her. That's the thought experiment. And in this example, we are clearly dealing with a person. This is a person with second-order volitions. It's an adult. Now, do you have a moral obligation to save her voluntarily? And many people would say no, as this infringes on your freedom and it's asking quite a lot. Uh, but let's say you had an accident in the hospital and you passed out, and the doctors attached you to the violinist against your will or without getting your permission. Now you wake up attached to her. Does this change anything? Do you have an obligation to stay attached to her? Thompson argues that if you say no, then the same should apply to abortion, provided that someone doesn't voluntarily or premeditatively become pregnant. Then they have no obligation to save that child, even if it is a person. This example would certainly have relevance in cases of rape. It would also apply to cases where birth control failed or pregnancy was genuinely accidental. Now, what if you voluntarily decided to save the violinist, and then in the middle you changed your mind because the procedure was much more extreme than you anticipated? Would you have a right to detach yourself from the violinist, even as she is a person? If you argue that you have no moral obligation to stay attached, then you would likewise hold that abortion is morally permissible, even when you voluntarily become pregnant. If you argue that you have a moral obligation to stay attached, then you would likewise hold that having an abortion is immoral when the pregnancy was voluntary. So Thompson's arguments, she gives us some great thought experiments where the issue of personhood is taken out of the equation, and you still have to weigh your moral obligations to other people who are depending on you. And her argument can be used to support the extreme right to choice position or the extreme right to life position, depending on how you respond to her thought experiments. But she used the thought experiments to argue for the right to choose position. Well, let's look at a moderate position on abortion. So moderates hold that at some stage of fetal development, abortion is morally acceptable, but that at others it is not. In other words, the longer you wait, the more a fetus turns into a person with rights. So most moderates argue that abortion in the early stages of pregnancy, like within the first 3 months, is morally acceptable, and that abortion in the late stages of pregnancy, like after the 6th month, is immoral, unless it is necessary to preserve the mother's life or physical health. So L.W. Sumner is a philosopher who makes such an argument, and she holds that there are degrees of personhood. Sentience is the first degree, which involves the capacity for feeling. And the forebrain appears at the end of the first trimester and is partially functioning at the beginning of the 3rd trimester. At this point, the fetus can feel pain, and according to Sumner, has a low degree of personhood. But personhood nonetheless, which means that it has rights as well. So Sumner's argument can be looked at as follows. Prior to the middle of pregnancy, abortion is like contraception, and a person is not harmed. But after the first half of pregnancy, the fetus has developed enough to meet the requirements of being a person, and abortion is more like infanticide, which is the killing of children. One thing you might do is go back through the slides with the different pictures of fetuses at different stages of development and see if there is some point where you see a person in that picture rather than just a being with human DNA or just a fetus. Perhaps there's a point where the fetus can survive outside the mother's womb, or maybe it's earlier. Now, these are things to think about and wrestle with, Again, be sure to read this week's chapter as our book's author leads an interesting argument about whether members of a different species can be considered to be people. And as we see with the issue of abortion, um, a lot of moral issues arise when you label another being a person. And he considers the case of dolphins in our book. As always, don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions about my lecture, the week's reading, or any of the assignments, including the final assignment coming up. And thanks a lot and have a great week.